we used to jokingly say that it was chuckimation, because sometimes we'd just chuck the doll in front of the camera.
Welcome to episode 4 of Panels and Pacing, an animation editing podcast. Today I'll be talking to David Fain, an animator, editor, director, and writer who's worked in animation for over 30 years, and whose work includes Spongebob Squarepants, KaBlam / Action League Now, G.I. Joe Renegades, and Transformers Prime and Transformers Earthspark. Hi, David.
Hello.
Before we get into our interview, I want to just kind of give a background on how we know each other. David and I met while working at Wild Canary, and he was working on the show The Rocketeer, and I was on Mira, Royal Detective. And we were actually kind of part of a pretty tight-knit group of editors, and we all pretty much remain friends to this day, even though some have moved out of state or moved out of the city. I want to quickly tell the story about how we met, because it's directly tied to how I started working at Wild Canary. We have a mutual friend, Chris Fitzgerald. He was my first editor that I worked as an assistant under when I first jumped into animation. And I was looking for work during a stretch, and I'd reached out to him just as a networking thing, and I randomly get an email with you CC'd on it being like, hey, it was great just to have lunch with you, David. Here's that editor Josh I was telling you about. I was like, oh, okay, what's this? And let's come to find out that you were working at Wild Canary, and you had just started on Rocketeer, and found out that the show Mira was a new show, and they were looking for another animatic editor. So I didn't know you, but I sent my resume over to you, and then I ended up getting the interview. And I get in the interview, and they're like, "Oh, David, how do you know David? We love David." And I was like, "Actually, I've never met him." So, yeah, I'm curious if you have what your side of
it. Kind of similar, because I remember I hadn't been there very long. I had worked for that studio on and off many times, and was kind of interesting that I was back there given the history of it. But yeah, Chris I knew because he and I had worked together at Hasbro, and he was actually an assistant editor there on Transformers Prime, or it might have been G.I. Joe Renegades. But in any event, he was so talented that they had another show going on, and the animatics were being done by the service studio, and they were coming back terrible. So they basically bumped him up, and that's how he ended up working on Rescue Bots.
Rescue Bots, yeah.
And so, yeah, I kept in touch with Chris, and at one point he sent me that letter because, that Wild Canary was gearing up. They were basically going from being a commercial house to being a series, doing series. And I'd worked on a previous series with them, but this time they had geared up, and I think they were trying to get 3 going at once. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, Chris sent me a note, and I was like, oh, that's great. Anybody who's good with Chris is good with me. And I remember they were walking you around, I think. And that was where we first met, was like in the hallway.
Yeah.
And, I was a little worried because I didn't know necessarily whether you told them that we didn't really know each other, and that it was kind of a recommendation through but that's one of those things that's sort of like, that's really, at least the way it used to go in the industry was, you knew somebody who heard about something, and that's kind of how you at least knew to apply.
Yeah.
And if you were lucky, that person had enough cachet with whoever it was that they would say, oh, so-and-so. And that's one of those reasons why, when you do recommend to people, you have to be careful, because if you do recommend somebody, that's not good, they're never going to come and ask you again.
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a tricky thing. And sometimes you want to get a second opinion on someone you've been recommended.
Well, it's funny because it was similar in a way. Joe Stuckey, who is another mutual friend of ours who came to work at Wild Canary, he was a former student of my wife's, and I was looking for I needed an assistant for that gig. And it was really interesting because he got hired right as we flipped to a union studio.
Yeah.
I basically kind of took him aside and said, look, this is what's going on. And if you want to be a part of it, even though you're officially not there yet, I think we were submitting our union cards his first day. Mm-hmm. So that's how I got into the union.
Yeah. Same with me. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to kind of bring that up also as a kind of one of the reasons why this group of editors that we were working with kind of became a tight-knit unit, was that the combination of the fact that Wild Canary kind of had these three shows going at once, and so they like suddenly went from having like one or two editors to like 10.
Yeah.
And they had set us all up in a separate office outside of the main office, and so we all kind of were like office mates, even though we weren't all working on the same show. And we would go out to lunches and stuff like that. And so yeah, my first week was when we were meeting with the union reps. And so our mutual friend Joelle was like, trying to corner me, and I thought she's like, oh, she's being really friendly, or something's going on. And then it turns out that they wanted to make sure that I was on board with getting in the union. So
Yeah.
of course I was, and yes, this also was my first union gig.
Well, it was sort of their mistake in a certain sense to put us all together so that we could compare notes and like figure out what was going on. I mean, that would have happened naturally, I think, but the fact that we were kind of like, I would say that, we went to lunch at least 2 or 3 times a week as a unit, kind of, people could get away at the same time.
There was a kind of an old school crew who had worked there with a lot of the people there, and then there was myself and a couple other editors that were new to the family.
Right.
So it was a good mix, and I always appreciated that, especially you and your background. But Tony, our mutual friend Tony, who's also has had a really interesting career with some kind of classic shows, and he was my animatic partner on Mira, and so yeah, we got pretty close. And I have been a big fan of likening crews and companies to sports teams. So in this sense, it was kind of like having like the veteran player having rookies under their wings or younger players under their wings, and I was kind of in my second career essentially, and working my way back up. Once I got to Mira, it was my second full-time animation editor job. So, and I hadn't worked in Premiere at that point before, so
Right.
kind of having Tony kind of helped learn me the ropes a little bit, and
And you had been working Avid previous to that?
Yeah. My first few years animation editing was all Avid, and the years before that, in reality, were all Avid up until I'm backtracking, but
Right.
it started off in Final Cut 7 back when that was a thing, and
Right.
then Apple released Final Cut 10, and that kind of like shifted the company's direction in terms of how professional their software was going to be, and that reality company decided not to stick with them and shift to Avid, and so that's how I essentially relearned Avid. Let's jump back and talk more about how you got started in the business, and then I kind of shift that
Right.
how you got into animation, because I know you didn't start as an editor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, when I look back on it, there's a lot of positions I had where I was doing editing, but it wasn't necessarily the title of the job. I started out in animation on a Nickelodeon show called Action League Now, which was part of KaBlam that you mentioned. It was this anthology series. And I was hired initially as a stop motion animator because the show was, it was mostly puppeted and live action, but at that point in time, there was probably maybe 10 or 20% of it was actual stop motion of animating these action figures. And we used to jokingly say that it was chuckimation, because sometimes we'd just chuck the doll in front of the camera. So anyway, I got a call from a grad school friend of mine who said, I know somebody who needs a stop motion animator for this project. If you're interested, you can come like crash on my couch and work for a couple of weeks. So I did that. And when it was over, they said, this is a series on Nickelodeon, and if you want a job, you have it. So I moved back to LA, and I was doing stop motion on this show. I immediately started pitching like ideas to the producer, director, showrunner. So, and these are little 5-minute segments of a larger anthology show. And then when that person got tapped to do a feature, I got bumped up to direct. The run of that show, I think I directed the last 13 episodes.
Nice.
But it's funny because I look back at that, and that was a show that didn't have animatics at all. We had very basic storyboards, but because so much of it was shot live action, there was no point in trying to time out, all these other things. My first real experience with doing a lot of storyboard editing or animatic editing probably came in when I started working at Warner Brothers in the early aughts for an internet division that they had. And so we did a lot of stuff that was Flash based. And again, we would get storyboards, but the animatic, basically what we would do is scan the boards in and then draw over the panels in Flash. So again, not really an animatic per se there. Probably the first time I was really doing what, we would consider as animatic editing was when I was working at a studio called Wild Brain on a project called The Ricky Gervais Show, where they basically took Ricky Gervais's podcast that he used to do with Carl Pilkington and Stephen Merchant. They just gave us that audio, re-edited. And so it was a very kind of talking headsy show.
Yeah.
Because most of it was like just their animated characters sitting in a recording studio. Occasionally, though, they would be talking about something and they would allude to it. And so we'd go into other animation. So they were working in Flash and I was cutting the animatics in Flash. So that made it easier for the animators basically to grab a chunk of animatic and, work with it or have it chopped up. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, about 3 episodes in, the storyboard artists couldn't keep up. So they had to hire some external freelance storyboard artists. And these artists were not working in Flash. They were working in Photoshop. So they were generating JPEGs or, some other image file. So that forced me to basically teach myself Final Cut. So I did Final Cut on that show for the first season of the Ricky Gervais. But then as a direct result of working in that studio, because once I started editing, I would get pulled off of the Ricky Gervais show to do other little things that they had. So like they were doing a bunch of Monster High stuff that I ended up editing. They did a direct-to-video Peanuts called Happiness is a Warm Blanket. So that was like a direct-to-video Peanuts movie that I ended up editing on for a little bit. And from that experience, the director I worked with on that, I found out later on, I got recommended for this job at Hasbro. And, I hadn't worked for a number of months and I got a call out of the blue from a guy saying, oh, so-and-so recommended you over at Wild Brain. We want to come in for an interview. And, that was something great. But the director who did recommend me was very adamant that I was pretty good. And that led to me getting the job over at Hasbro on G.I. Joe Renegades when Hasbro started up their own cable station. And that's basically the way the industry works, right? It's sort of like there's, I think your analogy of a sports team for like a production group for a show is very on point.
Yeah.
I also sometimes liken it to being in like a high school musical because you come together to do this thing and you all do it and then it ends and then you go off. And if you're lucky, maybe you come together again in another place at another time on another project.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've always loved that you were so involved with Action League Now because that was, I grew up as a kid watching Nickelodeon in the 90s. And so that was one of the like, fun kids TV at that time. And Action League Now and KaBlam in general was just such a fun, just throw stuff at the wall, especially Action League Now. I mean, literally, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
So,
I mean, the Action League one was sort of like the anchor property. That was kind of the one that I think every episode of KaBlam had an episode of Action League.
Speaking of 90s Nickelodeon, we can kind of talk about your credits writing on SpongeBob. If you want to get into that.
Yeah, the person who had recommended me for the Action League job was actually Steve Hillenburg, the creator of SpongeBob. I had gone to grad school with him at Cal Arts, and we had been pretty close. So after Action League ended, and I guess probably because I got some writing credits on that show, I got to be a staff writer on SpongeBob, which at the time was, maybe not what you would think, because when it first started, it's what was called a premise show, which basically meant there was no script, but you would come up with an idea. And when I was using an example that, I never actually did, but like SpongeBob gets caught shoplifting, that's the short thing. And it's like, well, of course, it's a case of mistaken identity. He's not really stealing, or he did, he accidentally did something and ended up with the thing in his pocket. And then, well, whatever it was, if the idea got past Steve, if he said, yeah, I think that's kind of interesting, and then it went up to the executive, and if it got past the executives, you were allowed to write like a half-page paragraph kind of describing what was going on. And then if that got approved, you wrote a 3-page outline that was more beat by beat. So it was like, this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And I got in trouble once because I tried to write dialogue. Yeah. Like SpongeBob says, quote, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, no. you do not write dialogue. You basically say SpongeBob says something about, Sandy's outfit. But what that actual sentence is going to be, they left to the storyboard artists. because once we finished our outline, that would be handed off to a team of two storyboard artists. And they could basically throw it completely away or use as much of it as they wanted to. So that was kind of interesting. And because there were three of us who were staff writers, and at that stage, we were only getting credit at the tail end of the episode under a very tiny thing that said staff writers, we kind of lobbied for it. It's like, well, look, we're doing the writing on these episodes. We should get, whoever the main writer is should get upfront credit. And they agreed with that. So when you see my credits, I have 4 upfront credits, I think. Mm-hmm. It's myself and the 2 storyboard artists. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was a fun show to work on. But, and I think Tony actually was one of the early animatic editors.
Yeah. Yep.
But we didn't meet till many years later.
Yeah, that's one of those things when I'm like bragging to friends that are outside the industry about like people that I've met while working on, enough of my generation of friends were into SpongeBob and that stuff. So I get to be like, oh yeah, I know some people that worked on the original seasons of SpongeBob, and so
those are the good ones. Some people, how long has the show been going now? 20 odd years,
maybe more even.
Yeah, so it's crazy.
Yeah. Would you consider either of those shows any of your favorite past projects, or do you have a different show that's maybe you consider your favorite?
I think my favorite is probably the Action League Now one, because for me, at that point, I was almost 40 when I came back. I think I was 38 when I came back to LA. And that's kind of a late in your career to be starting something new. Mm-hmm. But the other thing was that it was such guerrilla filmmaking. Yeah. And it was a very tight group of people, sort of because it had to be. And when we started, we would just go to people's houses and shoot in their house and in their backyard. And finally, by the end of it, we had rented studio space, because the premise of the show is you're watching these action figures in a normal human-sized environment. So it's kind of like you're watching the kid play, but there's no kid there.
Yeah.
So that one was probably my favorite. And I think after that, the next one would be the years over at Wild Canary when we were a union house, because it's another, the camaraderie that we had in that group of editors, just the fact that we sort of went through some of the same issues and we could advise each other.
I totally agree with the Wild Canary stuff. I think that what I've always enjoyed about, and yeah, I feel like I would if answering the same question, I maybe wouldn't say Mira as my favorite show that I worked on, but I definitely have a lot of fondness for the period of time in which I was working at that company with all you guys, because of the same reasons that you were talking about. It was great camaraderie. It was really educational in terms of pick up some tricks here and there. And obviously the union stuff and kind of learning how that whole process worked. And it felt very much like a good time to be there, because I think in the non-union years and the years before they started really kind of ramping up, having more shows, that they really weren't quite sure how to use editors in the full sense. And when we were there at that time, is they were starting to listen to us editors, understand the scope of what we could do and what other companies do with editors. And are there projects that you maybe didn't get a chance to work on that you saw friends working on or whatever that you wish you worked on? Or
I mean, as far as my personal favorite animated shows that I've seen of late, one is Common Side Effects, which is a Mike Judge show, which is a really interesting, it's an adult, quote unquote, an adult animation, but it's more about adult themes in the plot line than it is about, fart jokes that appeal to college students or something like that. And the other one is Scavenger's Reign, which is a great, there's so many sci-fi properties that could be made into shows for adults as opposed to shows targeted at kids. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So working on something like that would be great. And I have to say, that's, the thing that's always appealed to me about animatic editing is that it's kind of different from editing post-production in that you're at the front of the train.
Yeah.
You're kind of there helping them develop the story and the beats and everything, and not to, take away from what post-production editors do. But from my perspective, it always seemed like they got tasked with fixing all the things that couldn't be fixed or didn't get fixed when they should have. So in other words, something comes back from the overseas studio and it's not right. They're not going to do a redo, a reshoot,
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't do anything wrong from their perspective. So the
Yeah.
studio would have to pay basically for a new take.
Yeah.
And, that would, to avoid that, they throw it to the editor. And it's like, well, the problem is that this background doesn't match or this character comes in too soon. So you guys ended up doing some wizardry where it's like, well, I'm going to make a soft edge matte and use this half of the shot from over here from this other take that, the person flubbed the line, but the entrance is good. So, whatever. It's very technologically oriented, more so that, you're not worried about story. You're literally worried about how does this thing look? Is it going to pass QA?
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that, on some productions you are, directly impacting the story.
Mm-hmm.
But in animation, generally, once you have that animatic locked in, that's the blueprint. And anything beyond that, and maybe you can speak to this. I don't know how much variation you can get from, the animatic when it comes back.
It's interesting. Well, first I wanna say I like the analogy of the train. That's a good way of putting it, because often we're talking about the difference between animation editing versus live action, and it is an interesting way to put it, because the equivalent to live action is more of the like when you're kind of pre-production and fleshing out what what the director's shots are going to be, and there are
what the costumes are going to look like. Yeah.
But I think it's a little more rough and fluid at that stage than it is for animatics and animation, because once you lock down what your animatics are, that's what gets animated to the T. And so you really need to make all of the bulk of your creative decisions at that stage, so that you don't need to, like you said, have to pay for redoing things at the later stage. That would be the kind of equivalent of like shooting, on-set shooting.
Right, and then having to go back and do pickups.
Right. But to your second point about like you're limited by how much you can do once you get to the picture editing phase, yes, there's obviously truth to the budgetary concerns, and you're now working with a partner studio that you have contracted to do a certain amount of animation per episode for a certain amount of minutes per episode, certain amount of revisions per episode, and sometimes you do have a little bit of leeway in having in-house retake animators fix some stuff creatively. And so when you do have that option, and depending on how good the animation came back in, and depending on the creative direction of your show, sometimes you can do a lot of big swings in the at that stage. My recent show, Strip Law, I wasn't sure what to expect, because this was a creator who hadn't showrun an animation before, and it was an original concept, and he had very specific ideas in his mind about what he wanted the show to look like, but the process of how you get there and what the protocols are in the animation pipeline were what was new to him. So I didn't know what to expect, and we did end up like kind of really having like regular almost equivalent to how extensive our animatic editing sessions were once we got into picture. And sometimes we were cutting up shots and shifting stuff around, and if and when a mask didn't quite work and wasn't perfect, I would have to be like, all right, well, I got it 80% of the way there, but I have to send it to an animator to kind of patch it up and fix it that way. And so depending on your pipeline, you can do that. And I have found that being in the editor seat at the picture editing stage, you have a lot of roles to fill. And the primary thing should always be the creative of the show, because it's a creative craft. But because of how late you are in the process, there's also the idea that you need to be aware of the limitations, and you don't necessarily know what the budget of your show is, but you need to know that like, if this one shot gets take 3, take 4, take 5, like that's getting to be too much. And the challenge kind of becomes the tightrope of like, I want to be the best friend to the creator, and I want to be a positive contribution on that side. But then also the production and the producers, you want to kind of also not make sure that you're not making their jobs harder. And so trying to find that balance. Sometimes you find that it is not your role to be the person to tell the creator, no, you need to have your producer be that person.
Right.
But communicating to your producer when things are getting to that point is also something that producers will appreciate. So I've kind of found that, like, in addition to learning how to do the craft, learning how to understand the full scope of the pipeline and what steps you're at that point, how much rail you have left in the
Yeah, you have to be
schedule.
able to read the room, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And so even if it's not in the room telling a creator, no, I don't think we can do that, it's not your job to necessarily say that. But having that in the back of your mind and then later being like, hey, producer, FYI, we did a lot of edits on this last pass. You know, it's what he wants, but I put this problem in your court now.
Right, yeah.
It's
During
good.
the bathroom break, you take the guy aside and say, "We can do this, but it's going to entail X, Y, and Z, just so you know."
Yeah. So it's interesting, and I found that, like, that kind of, and maybe it's a false sense of ownership or your stance on the totem pole, the hierarchy of a show, but being at that last stage does kind of put you in the room at a lot of the critical last stages of it, and in a way that is probably more akin to like a lead feature editor
Mhm.
that's, always considered, like, one of the top voices, one of the top creative voices of a whole process, kind of put you in that space, despite the fact that most of the storytelling creative decisions have happened in the animatic phase.
Yeah, and now in some instances you're both, right? In jobs that you've worked where you've,
Yes.
you've done both the animatic and then are working on the post when the shots come back. I think that's the ideal situation because you kind of know what it took to get to where you're at, as opposed to suddenly just here's all this stuff, and then you're going like, well, why did they do this or why did they do that? And you understand because we're intimate with the process from the very beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because I feel like the union for the Motion Picture Editors Guild for a long time didn't really care much about animatic editors. I think when the animation boom happened, maybe something, some little light went on in somebody's head that went like, oh, look at all these animated projects and think about how many editors there are on the front end of every single one of those. Even animatic editing has gone through this evolution. And part of it is, I think, is, honestly, because of COVID and the fact that we went remote. When I was working at Hasbro, I remember having a lot of stress when I would have a session that included the showrunner, the head writer, somebody else, probably the episodic director, and maybe another person who was like a PA or somebody taking notes, and you'd all be crammed in this edit bay. And generally speaking, the hires up don't have a lot of time, so they're kind of like chop chop, let's go, let's keep going. But I felt like in that instance, I was more able to sort of insert myself creatively because we were all right there in the same room.
Mhm.
And I feel like as time has gone on, with working remotely, now you're not in the same room. Everybody's in a separate space. So I feel like there's been a bit of a shift in terms of some productions really wanting the animatic editor to be somebody who just executes what they're being told as quickly and efficiently as possible. So it's really about, like, are you good at the software? Do you know how to do these things in a way that's not going to slow down the process? And I've worked with some other animatic editors, and they're basically just trying to figure out how to get faster, how to get
Yeah.
faster, how to get faster. And it's sort of like, okay, but where's your creative part of the equation then?
Mhm.
And again, this may just be a personal bias of mine that I've sort of felt that over the years slipping away a little bit.
Mhm. It's stark how different sessions feel when it was like stuff in person, and then when we were doing stuff remotely. And the bulk of my time remotely was toward the tail end of Mira, and I didn't really see it at the time because Mira was kind of run as a show where, it being a new Disney show, I think they were very concerned about, like, not seeing any surprises when they got into the room to watch it, so we couldn't trim out dialogue. We could, that there was a certain kind of framework that we were expected to show. So sessions remotely didn't feel as like, oh, I'm missing my sense of ownership or my creative voice, because to that point, and again, I was one of the newer, this is again my second full animated show, so I didn't quite feel like I had yet earned the.
Right. You have to feel like confident enough to actually speak your mind, and
Yeah.
also knowing the individuals well enough. That's the thing about working in a crew. It's sort of like you know, if you make a suggestion and the showrunner glares at you, you know, okay, maybe this is not the time to do that. Whereas if you make a suggestion and they go, hey, you know what, he's right. You know, even if 9 out of 10 times they have a reason for not doing your suggestion, even if they just take it that one time, you feel like you've contributed and you've
Yeah.
made a difference.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, also going back to the comparison between doing animatics and doing picture, and Mira was one of these one of these shows where I did both. Once we got into picture editing, and our sessions were basically just to trim down to airtime. You know, we were 5 seconds long, we were 10 seconds long, we needed to get to a specific frame to air on Disney. That's when we kind of all ended up being way more on the same page, because there was creativity in where you were finding frames,
Right?
to
Yeah.
but
Could you lose?
the objective was, we have 5 seconds, where can we find it? And it was kind of like three of us, myself and the supervising director and the retake director, were kind of like mostly the ones who were looking at it. I think the pressure was off in terms of like, we're recutting the episode, and it was just like a little trim session. So those ended up going pretty smoothly, because we'd be like, I got one at 1 hour 18, or I got one at 18 seconds. Who does anyone else have it here? And like, yeah, no, I did too. Yeah, let's try to trim 3 frames.
Yeah, definitely. Because I can remember, you know, basically before going into a session, making my notes of, like, in an instance like that, of trims, and then kind of waiting till everybody else said theirs, and if they were ready to move on beyond the point I had one, then I knew it was like, well, I have this one still here if you want to hear it. And
Yeah, that also kind of applies where my last few shows as picture editor, I was able to go to mixes, and typically you have your showrunner as the main creative voice that is giving the re-recording mixer the notes, and then you might have some network executives in the room who are also giving their notes, and maybe the composer or someone from the sound department, music department is there catching, oh, that music cue should actually be this or whatever. And so
right.
my last couple of shows, because I had on these shows had earned the creative respect from the showrunners, I'd come in with my own notes, and sometimes they'd be like, do you look into me and asking for clarification on something, or they had a note, they're like, oh, we had something in the offline audio, do you remember what it was?
Hmm.
Or I would have something and they'd be like, oh no, that's good, yeah, no, it's good that you caught that, like, so that kind of stuff. Whereas on Mira, and I don't want to keep writing on Mira, it just was a different the show was just run differently, and toward the end of post on Mira, Wild Canary remained remote, but the audio, when we were doing mixes, they started letting people come in. It was, and doing mixes in person is way better. It's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do it remotely because you're not hearing the full surround
Yeah.
and stuff. So they started letting a handful of people in, and so I started coming in, and because it was my first one of my first mix opportunities to be in mixes, I just kind of sat back and just observed.
Yeah.
But I also kind of observed I observed Sasha, our showrunner, who has a musical background and was very particular about the sound in the audio of the show. He was in his element, and I was like, oh, he knows what he wants, and I don't feel like the show's missing out on my input at this stage. And I felt the same way. This was remote mixes, but I felt the same way on Frog and Toad, where our showrunner was very seasoned, and it was very clear at every step of the way he knew what he wanted from the show. At mixes, we were doing it remotely, so it's really hard to kind of hear things that sound off in that sense, and so we just kind of listen in, and he would be in the room doing it, one of the only people allowed to be in the room, and he'd kind of be like, anyone else have anything? And we're like, nope, sounds good to us. And but we just kind of see, when you see someone who's knows exactly what they want, it's kind of easy to be like, yeah, no, I think they got it, they're pretty confident.
Right.
Before we kind of shift out of the editing world, do you have any advice?
People in general trying to get into animation, this is like any of the other arts, in the sense that you really have to want to do it and love doing it. That's got to be the primary driving factor. If you're just looking to get a job or think this might be kind of fun, it's so competitive and it's so difficult that it needs to be something that you can't stop yourself from doing. In other words, even if you didn't have a job, you're working on some little animated project of your own. And I guess the other thing is that it's all about your relationships, in terms of guiding your career forward. So don't burn any bridges. I think probably we both worked on a number of productions that weren't exactly happy places to be, or they weren't run completely 100%. In editing it, I think it's really tricky now because there's this consolidation going on. We have the business of, people claiming that AI is going to replace all repetitive, processes. And I think the trick is to basically, love what it is you're doing, do it regardless of whether somebody's paying you. And hopefully at some point, some of the stuff you're doing not for pay is going to, if not, it's an education, number one, because you learn by doing. So even if you don't have a job, you should be kind of working on something. And I have to say, I've befriended some recent Rhode Island School of Design graduates who I met at a RISD event. And, they're all like hungry and looking for work, and they've got really interesting work on their reels. And it comes down to kind of playing the odds too, in terms of just apply for things, even things that you don't necessarily, don't narrow your focus to only things that you think are something you necessarily want to do. Sometimes you get an offer from something out of left field. It's not what you had planned, but it's worth doing because you learn something new, or even if you just learn, I don't want to do this. You know what I mean? At some point you have to, jump in and try it. All of my gigs have essentially come from personal relationships with people that I've made over the years. And, when I think back of, various productions I was on, there's certain individuals that even though it's been 10, 20 years, I'm still in contact with them. And when I was still looking for work, my technique for looking for work was to call up friends who had a job and take them out to coffee or lunch, find out what's going on in their studio. Is it a good place to work? Do they have other things happening? You basically tell them, I'm looking. If you hear about anything, let me know.
Yeah.
But the thing that sometimes students do, or people starting out do, is just approach someone and go, I want a job. And it's like that, well, everybody, there's tons of people who can say that, you have to be a little bit more directed. And, I had a guy when we were working at Wild Canary, a mutual friend had met him at some animation event. It might have been CTN. And he was somebody who, like you, had been working in live action reality and wanted to move into animation. And so this mutual friend basically said, I know a person who's working as an animatic editor, give him a call. Maybe he'll, walk you through things. And so this kid came over, and it was slow over at Wild Canary one day. So I spent about 2 hours with him, just, explaining our process and how this all went down. And I kept in touch with him. And then years later, I was over at DreamWorks, and they were like, you need an assistant. Do you have any people you'd like to, put their name in the hat? And I put this kid's name in the hat, and they hired him. And in fact, they kept him on after they fired me. That's how he got his foot in the door. It was that personal contact that led him to get a gig.
Yeah, no, that's all very valid. And again, I think like the thing at the top where I've mentioned that's how I got in at Wild Canary was a personal contact of mine talking to you, who's a personal contact of his. And yeah, this was just like, I did literally the same thing. I said, hey, Chris, I'm looking for work now. Let me know if you hear of anything. A couple weeks later, he ends up having lunch with you. And then you say, oh, this company needs an editor. And that's in the back of his mind. So I always say, like, planting the seeds with your network. Your network will grow the more places you work.
Yeah, I always, the analogy I used was you got to have a lot of irons in the fire, because basically you don't know which one's going to heat up first, and you need to something. And then it's like, it doesn't matter how glowing a recommendation, I give you, if you hadn't been able to handle it. In other words, it's like, I opened the door, or like Chris basically knocked on the door, I opened the door, and then you went through it. And after that, it was all on you. And that's the thing that people have to understand is, if you give somebody a recommendation, that's kind of like, you still have to pick up the ball. They still have to pick up the ball and follow through.
Yeah.
And it's why when you do give somebody a recommendation, you usually think twice about it to make sure that it's like, In other words, if you know this person's no good, you're not going to
Right.
recommend them. Or
Yeah.
they're problematic in this way, like they're a really nice person, but they're just, they're always late for everything.
Mhm.
You have to kind of weigh that and go like, well, do I think they're going to get their act together in this gig? Is that going to come back and reflect on me badly?
Yeah, I always like to tell people that once you get in on a place, and maybe even before, one of your first jobs is to kind of prove that you're not a jerk.
Yeah.
That people will want to work with you. You could be the best editor in the world, and if you're going to say no to everyone's suggestions and think that every idea that you have is what you should be doing, like, it's fine to have those opinions, but like, it's also not your show.
Yeah.
And people are going to want someone that you collaborate with, and collaboration is a two-way street. And even in interviews, you are being interviewed for the job, but you are also interviewing the company and the producers you're talking to, so you should also be asking the questions of like what it's like to work there, and what are the hours going to be, and is it okay if I have to go pick up my kid at 5 o'clock? Is it okay?
Right.
You want to make sure that it's the getting hired for a job is going to be mutually beneficial to the interviewee and the interviewer. And even once you get in on a job, your first few weeks, you're kind of showing them what you can do, but you're also kind of like, all right, are there any personalities I need to be aware of or kind of be wary of? And if your higher ups see that you're getting along with the rest of the crew, even if it's not every single person in the crew, if it's like, oh,
Right.
well, Josh gets along with this director really well, like, that's good. Other people move on from different jobs, and if you leave good impressions on them and show that you are a good person to work with and do good work, then
Right.
your odds are better that they might want to bring you on to something else. And
Yeah, I would say it's worth noting that being a good person to work with trumps your innate talent or ability. Like you were saying, if somebody's a real jerk, they're really good, they're really fast, but they're like a pain in the ass to work with.
mm,
You would pick somebody who's like maybe 10% slower, but is a nicer person. Basically somebody you enjoy spending time with.
yeah.
I mean, one thing I'd like to mention is that, what happens a lot, especially to people starting out, especially in animation, is because it's so time consuming, basically you're always running out of time. There's always stuff you're doing, and it basically comes down to, okay, well, this is the deadline. There's no more tweaking this. There's no more doing it. It's over. You have to be careful because, especially for new people, there's a tendency to kind of overachieve. So, for example, I've heard the story I'm telling is about storyboard artists, but it applies across the board. I remember going to one of the animation guild meetings and somebody complaining about basically where somebody would raise the level of the quality of something by putting in like an extra 4 hours on the
Mm,
board off the clock. In other words, like they've worked their prescribed amount of hours per day they're getting paid for, but because they want it to be so much better and they're really jazzed about it, they spend another 4 hours making it really, really good. Bar raisers. That's what this guy called it. He said,
okay.
what about these bar raisers? And so, what you have to understand coming in early is that they'll take as much as you will give them.
Yeah.
You might impress them, for a while, working, an extra 4 hours every night, but that's unsustainable. And it's also making the other people doing the same job look bad because they're only working their prescribed 8 hours and you're spending 12. So of course your thing looks better.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful not to exhaust yourself, not to burn out trying to impress everybody.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've actually been on the opposite end of that pep talk when I was in reality TV. One of my later shows, and this was kind of one of the last seeds of me kind of looking, be like, oh, maybe this part isn't for me. I want to maybe shift into something else. Where, yeah, a producer essentially had said to me, like, there are some editors who put in 10-hour days or 12-hour days, and you can tell with their work, and then there's some that put in 8-hour days, and you can tell with that, and kind of putting me in the 8-hour
Right.
period, and it was seen as a negative. And that's kind of one of the things that I've learned about kind of vetting a company's culture once you're there. And again, your mileage may vary. You may see that a company wants people to work 10-12 hour days and pays overtime for it.
Right.
And you're fine with that, and that's totally fine. If again, like, if you're passionate about the stuff you're working on and your instinct is to just work until the thing is done, and look up at the clock and you're like, oh crap, I missed or whatever. I mean, obviously, if you you should follow union rules of labor laws and stuff, whatever your contract is.
Well, it's
You know,
interesting because the reason I left Wild Canary before coming back for Rocketeer and being there for the Union Flip was the first show I worked on. They constantly were pushing meetings, edit sessions later and later, and there's always something. Generally after an edit session, there's some stuff that you as an editor need to do to pass it on to the next stage, whether it's like an export and then upload and all this other stuff. And so they were uniformly causing me to stay later
mm-hmm.
than I would. Again, this was before they were union, so it wasn't like I could say, "Oh, my union contract says I only can work 8 hours before you have to pay me overtime." There was no overtime to be paid. So
Mm-hmm.
I had to, at one point, basically say to them, "Look, you guys are pushing me into unpaid overtime on a fairly regular basis. So what I'm going to do as self-defense is, if I stay an extra hour, I'm coming in an hour later the next day." That worked to a certain degree, but it's interesting because of that kind of work environment. When I got a job offer from an old boss, she actually called up and asked me if I knew anybody looking for animatic work. And I went, "Hey, how about me?" Because I wasn't happy at Wild Canary at that point. And I ended up jumping back to Hasbro because of the way they were treating me. And then I think it was 3 years later, the opportunity to come back to Wild Canary happened. And I actually said to our mutual friend, Brian Dowley, I was having lunch with him, and he said, "Oh, they're looking for some animatic people." And I was like, "Well, do you think they would take me back after, I left kind of mid-production?" And said, "Well, only one way to find out." And at
Yeah.
that point, they wanted an animatic editor. They knew I was okay. So I got back in.
I feel like they almost like surprised themselves by how much editing work they needed at one time, and they were used to only having a handful of people to call on, and they just needed to expand their Rolodex a bit. And so, because I got the sense when I got brought on that they were really kind of desperate to bring, to have some extra help on there, and so it was one of a few interviews that I had at the time, and I had one in Warner Brothers that I was really kind of like hoping that I would get over the Wild Canary one, and I actually did turn down the Wild Canary one at first, and then they came back with more money
Oh,
and
great.
of staying on through picture. And when that came up, when the second offer came up, and I was like, so I did kind of like reach out to Warner Brother ones, and I was like, "Hey, I got an offer another company, but I'm really, was curious about this one." And they were like, "No, you should take that other one." So that was
Oh,
I think
wow.
Warner
Well,
Brothers,
we're honest.
looking back, it's funny. I was just recently looking back at who actually edited on that thing, and I think what they ended up doing was bringing some Warner Brothers people to work on that project that I had interviewed for. We found out as a pretty normal trend that certain places like to just repeat the same editors or hire the same people within their
Well, yeah,
family,
it's
and
that
they have
if
a
it's
requirement to interview outside of the company, but then end up picking someone that's going to be inside the company. So it's great if you're in retrospect. That may have been the situation for me over at Warner. I was the outside the interviewer,
right, you were the expert.
and they just were going to end up bringing, they were regardless were going to end up bringing on someone who had worked on one of their properties before. So I probably would have wound up having the Wild Canary one be my only offer on the table anyways. Another advice is advocate for yourself. If you think that a rate is too low, and you maybe have some other options on the table, try to negotiate in your best interest. Even my last few Titmouse contracts, after getting the offer, I came back in, and some of these were producers that I'd worked with and knew, and I was like, "Can you do a little better?" And they were able to. So,
Hmm.
I
Yeah, that's the thing. It takes a little while. Like
yeah,
it's always easier to get a job when you have a job.
yeah,
Even if you're exiting a place, it's always good to try and do it in a professional manner,
yeah,
regardless of how you actually feel about it. It's a very tough time now. The industry has always been cyclic. There are these incredible like peaks and valleys. It's just a question of where you are in the cycle in terms of the difficult. Like when it's peak and there's tons of jobs, it's easier to get a foot in because there's more jobs. When it's in a valley, then you're competing against all of the old timers who have much more experience. I mean, in some instances, that can hurt the long-term people because they're basically not going to work below a certain amount of money. Although I think for a lot of people, even that dropped
Yeah.
with the job market being what it is. You're hearing about people who are full-time editors taking jobs as assistants because that's the only thing that's around.
All right. Before we get into our last segment, I wanted to ask about any kind of like outside hobbies or hidden talents or outside of filmmaking passions that you have.
That's a good question. Because of the animation and the Action League thing, I have an incredible toy collection.
Mm-hmm.
But these are not toys in their blister packs. These are toys that have been picked up at yard sales and swap meets, and so I've got this entire backlog of things I've bought over the last 20 years to put into a stop motion film. And I haven't made a personal film. The last personal film I made was back in like 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Which was choreography for Plastic Army Men. It was an independent film I made animating Plastic Army Men. Mm-hmm. So I've been thinking about a sequel for a long time because you can get the same kind of plastic injection figures of scuba divers.
Oh yeah.
So I want to do a whole nother film that's all aquatic toys, basically. And my personal work is usually based off of I'll get a musical track and I'll use that as the spine of the film. So I haven't found the new musical track. I think once I can do that and I can clear some room in my garage, I'm hoping to make a new film.
Yeah. Yeah. Shout out to your garage. I've been there once or twice, and just kind of seeing some of the here's a little thing from this thing there, and it's not nicely curated like a museum, but it kind of feels a little bit like a museum of your animation history. So
the other thing I've considered is an independent film that I basically is tentatively called Inventory, and it's just me going through grabbing a box, doing an unboxing thing and then animating whatever's in it. And then the hope would be that once the thing has been animated, I can dispose of it and eventually get everything out of my garage.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there's something in there with like a Toy Story kind of thing where the toys have been in storage and they're coming out of the box, and then once they're out of the box, they reanimate and but it's stop motion and maybe have a story. Yeah. That's fun. I guess we can get into our freak out, geek out. Do you want to freak out about something, or do you want to talk more about a geek out? I guess
I don't know. It's not necessarily a freak out. It's kind of like the way production is changing that is kind of disappointing, I would say, as opposed to it's not something I freak out about. But for example, on my last gig, which was another Transformers property, Transformers Earthspark, we were required to use the sound effects library and music library that Paramount, the parent company, owned the rights to. So for me as an editor, one of the things that I used to really take pride in was my personal sound effects library and my personal music library. Working in animatics, any sound effects and music that you put in is, in theory, scratch. It's just it's to show the sound designer and or the composer the tonality that this person is looking for, or the feeling.
And sometimes just the rhythm and the pacing, just kind of help move the action sequence along.
I have my own music library and my own sound effects library to a certain extent memorized, in the sense that I know what's in there. And I need something sad, I'll go over here. So then to be presented with okay, you can't use any of that stuff. You have to use so I found it very frustrating in that I had to I basically had to learn their library in order to put things in. And I don't know if part of the rationale for doing that was that they could have kept the sound effects and they could have kept the music because they already owned it. So, and that I find a little, I wouldn't say, it's worth freaking out, but, I would be curious going forward to know how many other animatic editors have encountered some rules like that, and whether that's led to the studios actually just using existing music as the final music on a production and cutting out the composer and cutting out the, sound designer.
Yeah.
Basically, if the animatic person has already done that work with things that are free and usable, I mean, and that's a relatively new development.
Yeah, I talked to some of our union like sound mixers that work primarily in animation, and the term job creep kind of comes up a lot in that sense of how much animatic editors and picture editors and even dialogue editors at certain stages in certain places do so much sound design, and from a post sound editor's perspective, yeah, like you said, normally they would just scratch all of that and rebuild it, and having someone earlier in the process build it and oftentimes work really creatively and intentionally with sound design and scoring with creators, and then creators end up getting married to that those effects and those cues, really taking that last step of the process that is normally, someone does that fresh or uses a licensed library. Doing sound design at that stage is, I also enjoy doing it. I feel like regardless of whether that stuff gets and ends up in the final product, one of the things about animatics is that you need to kind of suspend your disbelief and watch it as if it is the finished product in order to understand what the finished product is gonna be. And oftentimes you're trying to sell executives and studio people who are not as used to watching unfinished animation, trying to help them visualize what the finished animation is going to look like so they can sign off on, yes, this is a good animatic, let's go ahead and move that. And good scoring and good sound design helps fill something out, fill the soundscape out that tricks your brain into thinking that something is more finished than it maybe is visually. I feel like it's an important part of the process. At least one of my friends would probably advocate for having that editor be a part of that animatic process and be the one doing that sound design at that stage. If the idea is that, we already have the licensed stuff we want to use, but we want to do it at this phase, bring that person in. Then it has been interesting to see how certain aspects of the process has changed. And I think, we talk a lot amongst our community about the job creep between editors and storyboard artists, and specifically in timing out storyboards, and even sometimes putting in sound design, dialogue, or sound effects and music sometimes. As that program that they use has gotten better and maybe been able to incorporate more editing tools, traditional editing tools, they've been able to do that and asked to do that, and it's kind of become a gray area where, especially because there are directors, episodic directors and supervisor directors that, yes, should obviously have a say in the timing of how the storyboards are going to be, but are often doing it themselves in that program and telling editors, hey, don't touch my timing, which is, for animatic editors, one of the main things that we're there to do.
Yeah, basically.
So yeah, it's definitely one of these big conversation, and I know within our community, it's something that we've been trying to figure out how to address. Is it something that you can have the union help out with by incorporating that into job titles within contracts? Is that something we need to work with the Animation Guild and their job classifications? I am kind of an advocate for just like at the beginning of starting a job, talk to your directors, talk to your storyboard team, kind of get on the same page about what's expected of everybody. And sometimes maybe even things will be dictated by how the showrunner wants to run it. Like I said, my last show, the showrunner really felt more comfortable doing a lot of the creative stuff in the edit with us. So and we were doing a lot of timing and stuff like that. So that was just kind of like an unavoidable, all right, well, yeah, storyboard team can do some edit stuff, but like, we're going to time it out and he's going to sit with us and retime everything. So why do they need to spend so much time doing that?
Well, it's like doing the same job
anyway, so
over and over again.
Yeah. I was trying to toy with the idea. This is the first geek out I've gotten to do. I was trying to think of maybe some fun animated projects that I saw. I did just check out Tubi has a new series that's, I think it's called Toon World Express. And it's basically just kind of a series of shorts that are independent animation, just kind of like the stuff that you would see like late night on Adult Swim back in the early 2000s. It's kind of like experimental, kind of out there stuff that's just like, I feel like mainstream animation, streaming and traditional broadcast animation has mostly become pretty visually tame, I guess is the, stuff like you mentioned, Scavenger's Reign and stuff that like is visually interesting, but like not the kind of like wacky kind of crazy, like, oh my God, like psychedelic kind of stuff that like that
Right.
really shows how almost insane you can get with animation.
Yeah.
And that stuff is like, especially in short form, is really cool. And I always kind of like being able to see that stuff in broader formats, just because I hate whenever I hear, oh, I'm not interested in animation because it's kids entertainment or it's just
Yeah.
for kids or whatever. It's like, no, it's not. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. And the other thing I wanted to quickly geek out about is related to animation. I got this new hat from New Era. They had a collaboration with The Simpsons. So it's like the blue cloud, and they have it for every team. And so obviously I'm a Red Sox fan. But yeah, all around they got the blue clouds in there. So I wanted to bring it in, here and place in the background as a subtle thing. But I'm geeking out about it as well. This is one of the first times I bought a hat where I'm like, I feel like I don't want to wear it. I want to just keep it preserved.
Yeah, don't want it to get sweaty.
Yeah. But yeah, it's here. It's in the background. I'm geeking out about it. Thanks again, David, for being here with me. And there's so much about your career that's so interesting, and I'm glad we got to talk a lot about it. And thank you for submitting my resume to Wild Canary back in the day. And that allowed us to meet, both of us to get in the Editors Guild. And I really do feel like that was. And it's good to hear you say this, kind of like a real pivotal, nice chunk of my career that I always kind of fondly look back on. So I'm glad that we stayed in touch, and thank you for being here.
Sure, my pleasure.